Imagine the Egyptian sun, a relentless white-hot eye in a sapphire sky. You feel the heat radiating from the limestone blocks of a half-built temple, the air thick with the scent of lotus blossoms, river silt, and the faint metallic tang of blood from a distant sacrifice. We picture ancient Egypt as a civilization of stoic grandeur, of golden masks and silent tombs, a people obsessed with a serene, orderly journey into the afterlife. We see the serene faces of the pharaohs, carved into eternal stone, and we assume their lives, their beliefs, were as measured and rigid as the hieroglyphs that tell their stories. But this is a carefully constructed illusion. Beneath the gilded surface, behind the impassive gaze of the Sphinx and the sacred silence of the pyramids, lies a truth so profoundly disturbing, so fundamentally alien to our modern minds, that it has been whispered about by historians for centuries. This is not a story about love, romance, or desire as we understand them. It is a descent into a world where sex was not an act of intimacy, but a terrifying and awesome power, a cosmic force that could create universes, resurrect gods, and guarantee the survival of the entire nation. And when this power was wielded by mortals, it led to practices that blur the line between the sacred and the depraved, between humanity and monstrosity. To understand this, you must first erase everything you think you know about morality. Forget the concepts of sin and virtue, of good and evil. For the ancient Egyptians, the universe operated on a single, terrifying axis. Ma'at, the divine principle of order, truth, and cosmic balance, and Isfet, the unceasing, ever-present threat of chaos, darkness, and non-existence. Every single ritual, every law, every prayer was a desperate battle to uphold Ma'at and push back the slithering tendrils of Isfet. And the most powerful weapon in this eternal war, the source code of all creation, was sex. Their entire cosmology began not with a spoken word, but with a physical act. In the beginning, there was only the dark, swirling, primordial ocean of chaos called Nun. From these waters, the first god, Atum, willed himself into existence. He was utterly alone. There was no sky, no earth, no other being. And in that infinite solitude, to begin the act of creation, Atum took his own phallus in his hand. From this solitary, cosmic act of masturbation, he ejaculated. And from his seed, he spat forth the first divine pair, Shu, the god of the air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Think about the staggering implication of that foundational myth. For you and I, this might seem primitive, even shocking. But for every man, woman, and child living along the Nile, this was the divine blueprint for reality. If the universe itself was born from a solitary, sexual act performed by a creator god, then the act itself could never be inherently wrong or shameful. It was not a sin, it was a source of unimaginable, generative power. This belief seeped into every corner of Egyptian life. A farmer standing by the banks of the Nile didn't just see a river, he saw the life-giving semen of the earth gods, the promise of a harvest that kept the chaos of starvation at bay. The pharaoh, high in his palace, was not just a king, he was the living incarnation of the god Horus, the earthly conductor of this divine, creative energy. His virility was not a private matter, it was a national resource. If the pharaoh was potent, the Nile would flood, the crops would grow, and the armies would be victorious. He was the human linchpin, holding back the forces of Isfet. And his primary tool was his own sexuality, which he was expected to publicly and ritually demonstrate. This transformed the act of sex from a personal experience into a terrifying public responsibility, a tool of cosmic engineering. But what happens when a belief system this potent spirals into obsession? What happens when the desperate need to create life, to uphold order, and to cheat the finality of death pushes these sacred ideas into the darkest corners of human behaviour? It leads to a place where the lines are not just blurred but erased entirely, a place where the duties of the living become grotesquely entangled with the bodies of the dead. Let us descend into that entanglement. The journey begins where all Egyptian journeys ultimately end, in the house of the dead. It is a place of profound religious significance, a sacred workshop where the body is prepared for its eternal voyage. But it is also a place of profound vulnerability. The Greek historian Herodotus, a man who travelled the known world and documented its strangest customs, tells a story that rips the mask of piety from the face of ancient Egypt. He speaks of the embalmers, the men entrusted with the most sacred duty of all. These were not priests or nobles, they were craftsmen, specialists who possessed a secret, gruesome knowledge of human anatomy. They held in their hands the physical vessel that would carry the soul, the ka and the ba, into the afterlife. And Herodotus tells us that sometimes this sacred trust was betrayed in the most monstrous way imaginable. He writes with a tone of shocked disbelief of a discovery made by a noble family. They had delivered the body of a recently deceased woman, a matriarch of high standing, to the embalmer's workshop. But a suspicion, a gnawing unease, led the husband to make inquiries. What he uncovered was a practice of such defilement that it sent a wave of horror through the Egyptian aristocracy. He learned that one of the embalmers had been caught in the act of violating the fresh corpse of his wife. Imagine the scene. The wabet, the pure place, is silent save for the buzzing of flies and the quiet scrape of tools. The air is heavy with the funereal perfume of myrrh, cassia, and palm wine, mixed with the acrid stench of drying natron salt. On a limestone slab lies the body of a woman who, just days before, commanded a household, wore jewels of lapis and gold, and held immense social power. Now she is utterly powerless, an object under the complete control of a man who, in life, would never have been permitted to even look her in the eye. For this embalmer, this was not just a perverted act of lust. It was a terrifying inversion of the cosmic order. It was an act of isfet, of chaos, an assertion of dominance over the highest echelons of a society that had placed him at the bottom. The violation was not just physical, it was metaphysical. It was an attack on her very soul, a stain on her spirit that could jeopardize her entire journey through the underworld. To the ancient Egyptians, this was a fate worse than death. It was the threat of eternal oblivion, of being devoured by the soul eater, amit, and ceasing to exist entirely. The horror of this act was so profound that it forced the Egyptians to invent a solution, a preventative measure so pragmatic, so ghoulish, that it reveals the depth of their terror. Herodotus tells us that from that point on, the bodies of beautiful women and the wives of prominent men were no longer handed over to the embalmers immediately after death. Instead, the family would keep the body at home for 3 or 4 days. They would let it lie in the Egyptian heat, allowing the natural process of decay and putrefaction to begin, until the corpse was no longer considered attractive. Let that sink in. A society so obsessed with the perfect preservation of the body, a culture that invented one of the most complex and sophisticated mummification processes in human history, was so terrified of necrophilia that its upper classes deliberately allowed their loved ones to begin to rot, simply to make them unappealing to the men who would prepare them for eternity. This was not a moral judgment. This was a brutally practical defense against an act they saw as a form of cosmic terrorism. But here, the story takes an even more disturbing turn. Because while the mortals of Egypt were devising ways to prevent the violation of their dead, their most sacred myths were telling a very different story. The foundational story of resurrection in Egyptian belief, the story of the god Osiris, is a story of divine necrophilia. Osiris, the good king, is murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother, Set, the god of chaos. His body parts are scattered across the length of Egypt. His devastated wife and sister, Isis, the goddess of magic, tirelessly searches for his remains. She reassembles her husband's body, piece by piece, anointing him with oils and wrapping him in linen, performing the first act of mummification. But one part is missing. His phallus had been eaten by a fish in the Nile and could not be recovered. The vessel was incomplete. Resurrection, it seemed, was impossible. But Isis, in her grief and her power, would not be denied. Using her magic, she fashioned a new phallus for her dead husband. Some myths say from gold, others from clay. Then, transforming herself into a kite, a graceful bird of prey, she hovered over the inert, reassembled corpse of Osiris. In an act of divine necrophiliac magic, she lowered herself onto his artificial phallus and, through this union with a dead god, conceived a son, Horus, the falcon-headed god, the avenger of his father, and the rightful heir to the throne of the universe. This act wasn't seen as a transgression. It was the ultimate act of creation in the face of destruction, the ultimate triumph of Ma'at over Isfet. It was a sacred act of life-giving violation. So now we have a terrifying paradox. A society that mutilates its own dead to prevent sexual violation, while simultaneously worshipping a goddess who performs that very act to save the world. What did this mean for the most powerful man in that society? What did this divine precedent mean for the pharaoh himself, the living Horus, when it was his time to die and become one with Osiris? The answer to that question lies buried with the pharaoh himself, deep within the silent, suffocating darkness of his tomb. For millennia, we saw these tombs as grand, static monuments, treasure houses filled with gold and chariots, meant to serve the king in some vague, ethereal afterlife. We were wrong. The tomb was not a house. It was a machine, a complex biological engine of resurrection, designed to replicate the cosmic drama of Osiris's rebirth, powered by the most potent forces the Egyptians knew: magic, ritual, and sex. And at the heart of this machine, we find one of the most enigmatic and disturbing collections of artifacts ever discovered in Egypt, the so-called Phallic figurines. For decades, when Egyptologists first began to clear the sand from these royal tombs, these objects were a source of quiet embarrassment. They were small, crudely carved figures of men with grotesquely oversized, erect phalluses. Sometimes they were made of clay, sometimes wood. They were often found scattered around the sarcophagus, placed near the king's mummified body. For a long time, they were dismissed as simple fertility charms, primitive symbols of virility meant to ensure the king's potency in the next world. They were catalogued, stored away in museum basements, and rarely spoken of in polite academic society. But that was a profound misinterpretation. They were not just symbols, they were tools. They were the physical components of a ritual so strange, so explicit, that it forces us to reconsider the very nature of Egyptian funerary beliefs. To understand their true purpose, we must look at the spells inscribed on the tomb walls, the sacred texts known as the pyramid texts, and the coffin texts. These were not just prayers, they were a divine instruction manual, a step-by-step guide for the dead king's soul. And these texts describe, in unambiguous detail, what needed to happen for the king to be reborn. The dead pharaoh, now identified with the murdered god Osiris, was inert, helpless, incomplete. Like Osiris, he lacked the generative power to initiate his own resurrection. He needed a catalyst. He needed an external force to reawaken his divine virility. The texts describe a ritual where the dead king is sexually stimulated. Spell 534 of the coffin texts is chillingly direct. Raise yourself up, O king, for you have not died. Your son Horus has acted on your behalf. He makes your phallus stiff so that you may beget. Another spell speaks of the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, his sister servants, coming to him in the darkness of the tomb. They are described as weeping, lamenting, and then taking matters into their own hands. They are instructed to grasp the phallus of the dead king, to place it to their vulvas, and to provoke an issuance, to magically extract the divine seed that would become his own heir and successor in the form of the next pharaoh. This was not metaphor. The Egyptians believed this had to happen, physically and magically, and those crude, phallic figurines, they were the stand-ins, they were the ritualistic focus of this divine necrophiliac act. They were avatars for the king's sexual power, physical representations of his divine member, to be magically activated by the spells and the presence of the goddesses. But who was to perform this ritual? Isis and Nephthys were goddesses, not present in the flesh. The task fell to the priests, and perhaps even to the royal women who participated in the funerary rites. Imagine the scene, in the flickering torchlight of the sealed burial chamber, surrounded by the scent of essence and decay. The chief priest, wearing the jackal mask of Anubis, the god of embalming, would chant the ancient guttural spells. The women of the court, the king's wives and daughters, would keen and wail, their mourning designed to mimic the lamentations of Isis. And as the incantations reached their crescendo, their focus would turn to these small, unsettling figures. They were magically charging the king's dormant sexuality, performing a ritual act of divine masturbation on the symbolic body of their dead father, husband, and god. They were reenacting the creative moment of Atum, but in the terrifying darkness of the grave. They were becoming Isis, using necrophilia as a tool of resurrection, ensuring that the divine seed of kingship would be transferred from the dead Osiris to the living Horus, the new pharaoh waiting outside the tomb. This ritual collapses our entire understanding of family, piety, and sex. An act that on the surface appears to be the most profound incest and violation becomes, in this bizarre logic, the ultimate act of filial piety and political necessity. But this obsession with generative power, this belief that the act of creation could conquer even death itself, wasn't confined to the tombs of kings. It spilled out into the world of the living, into the very temples of the gods, and led to a practice that involved not just the dead, but the living avatars of the gods themselves, the sacred animals. It leads us to the mystery of the Mendes goat, and a public ritual so shocking that it made even the worldly Herodotus recoil in horror. Our journey now takes us from the claustrophobic silence of the tomb to the bustling, vibrant city of Mendes in the Nile Delta. Mendes was the cult centre for the ram-headed god Bnebjedet, a powerful deity who embodied the principles of creation and fertility. The name Bnebjedet literally means the Ba, or soul, of the Lord of Jedet, and he was considered the living soul of the gods Osiris and Ra. He was a god of primal, untamed virility, and like many Egyptian gods, he was not just worshipped as an abstract concept. He had a living, breathing incarnation on earth. This was the great ram of Mendes, a sacred animal chosen for its size, its strength, and most importantly, its prodigious sexual appetite. This ram was not just a mascot, it was the god himself, in the flesh. It lived in a gilded enclosure within the temple complex, attended by its own retinue of priests, fed the finest foods and adorned with jewels. Pilgrims travelled from all over Egypt to witness this living god, to leave offerings, and to ask for blessings, particularly for fertility. The virility of the Mendes ram was a divine oracle. Its energy was believed to flow out and enrich the entire land. But the worship of this god, this living embodiment of raw, animalistic sexuality, culminated in a public festival that stands as one of the most baffling and disturbing rituals in all of antiquity. Herodotus, our ever-curious and often horrified guide, describes the scene. During the grand festival of Mendes, an event that drew massive crowds, a woman was chosen for the highest and most terrifying of honours. In full public view, within the temple precinct, this woman would perform a ritual act of sexual intercourse with the sacred ram. Herodotus is blunt, stating simply that this took place publicly. The Roman geographer Strabo, writing centuries later, confirms the practice, adding that the women who were chosen for this role were often of high social standing. Let us try to reconstruct this moment, to strip away the centuries of judgment and see it through their eyes. The air is thick with the smoke of incense, the sound of sistrums shaking, the chanting of priests, and the roar of the festival crowd. The chosen woman, who we must assume was not a victim but a willing participant, perhaps even a priestess or a noblewoman who had vied for this role, is brought forward. She is likely adorned as a bride, prepared for a sacred marriage, a hieros gamos. But her groom is not a man. It is the great ram, the living god, a powerful, aggressive animal guided by priests. The act that follows is a public spectacle. It is not about intimacy or pleasure. It is a raw, terrifying, and awesome act of cosmic theatre. To the modern mind, this is nothing short of bestiality, a grotesque and perverse public display. But to the people of Mendes, this was the ultimate act of communion with the divine. The woman was not mating with an animal, she was mating with the god of creation himself. She was becoming a vessel for his divine energy, a conduit through which his life-giving power could be channeled directly into the human world. This was not a secret, shameful act hidden in the shadows. It was the climactic, celebrated centerpiece of their most important religious festival. The purpose was magical. By physically joining the human and the divine, the animal and the spiritual, they believed they were reinforcing the very fabric of the cosmos. The act was a living prayer for fertility, for the abundance of the crops and the livestock, for the continuation of life itself in the face of the ever-present threat of chaos and famine. The woman who performed this act would have been seen as incredibly blessed, temporarily elevated to the status of a divine consort. But beneath this theological justification lies a darker, more unsettling psychological reality. This ritual represents the absolute apex of their obsession with the physical mechanics of creation. They had become so fixated on the act of procreation as a magical force that they were driven to ritually enact it in its most raw and primal form. They had stripped away all emotion, all human connection, and reduced the sacred act of creation to a biological transaction between a woman and a beast, all for the sake of cosmic stability. But this public, ritualized sexuality was not just about ensuring the fertility of the land. It was also a tool of political power, a way for the pharaoh to demonstrate his absolute control not just over his people, but over the natural world itself. The pharaoh, as the living Horus, was the guarantor of Ma'at. His primary duty was to ensure the annual life-giving flood of the Nile River. The inundation was everything. A low Nile meant drought, famine, and societal collapse. A high Nile meant a catastrophic flood that could wipe out villages. The flood had to be perfect, and so the pharaoh developed a ritual to personally command the river. Every year, at the beginning of the inundation season, the pharaoh would lead a great procession to the banks of the Nile. There, in a ceremony witnessed by his priests and nobles, he would perform a ritual act that mirrored the creative act of the god Atum. At the dawn of time, he would masturbate, and his semen would be collected in a sacred vessel and then poured into the river. This was not a symbolic gesture. To the Egyptians, this was a direct, magical insemination of the river god, Hapi. The pharaoh, in his divine potency, was adding his own creative essence to the waters, ensuring a perfect, life-giving flood. He was, in the most literal sense, fucking the river to save his country. This act elevated the pharaoh beyond a mere king. It made him a cosmic husband, a partner to the forces of nature, a man whose personal bodily fluids held the power to sustain 60 million lives and hold back the apocalypse of chaos. This was the ultimate expression of power, a power so absolute it could command the very tides of creation. And it would lead to one final, terrifying conclusion. If the pharaoh's sex could create life, then it must also hold power over those who had lost it. It brings us back full circle to the dead. But this time, it is not about resurrecting the king. It is about a pharaoh so lost in his own divine power that he sought to use it to control the spirits of his own family. The ultimate fusion of this divine authority and twisted personal grief brings us to a pharaoh whose name is synonymous with grandeur, power, and a building obsession that reshaped the very landscape of Egypt, Ramesses the Great. Ramesses II reigned for an astonishing 67 years, a period of unparalleled prosperity and monumental construction. He was the quintessential god king, a living legend who fathered over 100 children and plastered his own image on every temple and monument from the Delta to the Nubian frontier. He was not just a pharaoh, he was the pharaoh, the living embodiment of Egyptian power and divine mandate. But behind this facade of indestructible authority was a man who loved, and a man who grieved. And his grief would drive him to commit an act that shattered one of the most sacred taboos of Egyptian society, an act that twisted the sacred rites of resurrection into a personal, possessive, and profoundly disturbing obsession. The centre of Ramesses' world was not his throne, nor his army, but his great royal wife, Nefertari. Her name meant the most beautiful one. And by all accounts, she was not just a queen, but Ramesses' soulmate and most trusted advisor. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is regarded as the most beautiful in all of Egypt, a testament to the profound love he held for her. But Nefertari died relatively early in his long reign, leaving a void that Ramesses seemed unable to fill. He elevated other wives, but none held the place Nefertari had. He also had numerous daughters, and in the years following Nefertari's death, Ramesses began to do something unprecedented. One by one, he started marrying his own daughters. The first, and most prominent, was Bintenath, his eldest. After her mother's death, Ramesses elevated her to the rank of great royal wife. She became his queen. This was not a symbolic title. Inscriptions and reliefs depict her taking on all the official roles of her mother, standing beside her father king as his consort in the great rituals of state. Then he married his daughter Meritamen, and then Nebetawi. To our sensibilities, this is incest, plain and simple. A father taking his own daughters as his wives is a transgression of the highest order. But to place this act in its proper, terrifying context, We must abandon our own moral framework and re-enter the twisted logic of the divine pharaoh. For Ramesses, this was not about lust. There is no evidence to suggest this was driven by simple sexual desire. He had a massive harem filled with hundreds of women from across his empire. This was about something far stranger. It was about preservation, duplication, and a desperate attempt to cheat death by recreating what he had lost. In the Egyptian mind, divine essence was passed through the bloodline. Nefertari had been a vessel of this divine power. His daughters, born of their union, carried that same sacred essence. By marrying them, Ramesses was not simply taking new wives, he was attempting to preserve and concentrate that divine bloodline. He was trying to recapture the lost magic of his union with Nefertari by marrying the next best thing, her living copies. His daughters were not just his children, they were living echoes of their dead mother. By making them his queens, he could, in a ritual sense, keep Nefertari alive. He could look upon his daughter Bintanath, standing in her mother's ritual place, wearing her mother's titles, and see not his child but the ghost of his beloved wife. But the act goes deeper than just a twisted form of mourning. It is the ultimate expression of divine narcissism. The pharaoh was a god. Gods were not bound by human rules. The creator god, Atum, created the universe from his own body. The divine siblings Shu and Tefnut, and later Geb and Nut, engaged in incestuous unions to create the world. Osiris married his sister Isis. By marrying his daughters, Ramesses was not breaking the rules. He was demonstrating that he was above them. He was performing his godhood. He was showing his people, and perhaps himself, that his grief, his desires, and his will were so powerful they could literally reshape the fundamental laws of kinship and society. He was transforming his family into a living monument to his own power and his own loss. This was not a private family matter. These unions were public, celebrated in inscriptions and reliefs for all to see. Imagine being Bintanath. Your entire life you have worshipped your father as a living god. Your mother, the great queen, dies. And then this god, your father, declares that you will now take her place. You will become his wife. You will stand beside him in the holiest of rituals, not as his daughter, but as his consort. Your public identity, your very womanhood, is now inextricably linked to the memory of your dead mother, your body a vessel for your father's grief and divine ambition. Every public ceremony becomes a strange and disturbing performance, a constant, living reminder that you are not just a queen, but a replacement. This practice reveals the terrifying endgame of a belief system that fuses sexual power with divine right. It creates a reality where the most intimate human relationships, father and daughter, husband and wife, become twisted into political tools and rituals of cosmic significance. Ramesses' actions show us a man so consumed by his own divinity that he saw his own children not as individuals, but as extensions of his own will, as raw materials to be used in his personal war against loss and the finality of death. He was not just a king ruling a country, he was the centre of his own self-created universe, a universe where love, grief, and power had collapsed into a monstrous singularity. The pharaoh had become Atum, recreating his world not from primordial chaos, but from the bodies of his own children. The thread of this sacred sexuality, woven through funerary, rites, temple worship, and royal ideology, also ran deep into the private lives of ordinary Egyptians. While the pharaoh was inseminating the Nile and marrying his daughters, the common farmer, scribe, and soldier were navigating a world where magic was not a metaphor, but a tangible, everyday force. And the most potent magic of all was sexual magic. Love, desire, and jealousy were not just emotions, they were battlegrounds where magical spells and curses were the weapons of choice. If you wanted to attract a lover, you didn't just rely on charm. If you wanted to punish an unfaithful partner, you didn't just confront them, you commissioned a spell. And these were not gentle, romantic incantations. They were spells of aggressive, magical coercion, designed to dominate the will of another person, to bind them to you, and to inflict terrible suffering if they resisted. The magic sought to bypass consent entirely, to turn another human being into a puppet of your desire. Archaeologists have unearthed countless examples of these spells, inscribed on papyri or etched onto lead tablets known as curse tablets. Let us examine the mechanics of one such spell, a spell to force a woman named Taram away to love a man named Kephalas. The spell is not a polite request to the gods. It is a violent, terrifying command. Kephalas, or the magician he hired, begins by invoking the restless spirits of a dead person, often someone who died violently or before their time. These spirits, trapped between worlds, were believed to be powerful and dangerous agents, willing to do the bidding of a magician in exchange for peace. The spell instructs this ghost to go, enter into Taram way, and to drive her out from her house, from her city, from every place. The goal is not to woo her, but to make her life so unbearable that her only solace can be found with Kephalas. The spell continues with a litany of psychosexual torture. Do not let her eat. Do not let her drink. Do not let her sleep. Let her have no rest. Burn her heart, her liver, her lungs, her bones. Make her eyes ache until she comes to me. The language is brutal, a magical assault on her physical body. But the spell then moves to a new level of violation. The magician creates a doll, a small effigy of Taramiwe. These were not innocent toys. They were voodoo dolls, direct magical links to the victim. The doll would be inscribed with Taramwe's name, and often the name of her mother, to ensure the magical targeting was precise. Then the magician would take 13 copper needles. The spell provides exact instructions on where to pierce the doll and what to say with each piercing. I pierce your head so you will think only of me, Kephalas. I pierce your eyes so you will see only me. I pierce your ears so you will hear only my voice. I pierce your mouth so you will speak only my name. I pierce your hands so you cannot work or touch another. I pierce your heart so you will feel this burning fire of love for me. And most chillingly, I pierce your vulva so you will have no sexual desire for any other man but me, Kephalas, and so you will remain chaste until you come to me. The spell concludes by commanding the spirit to drag her by her hair, by her clothes, by her very soul until she leaves her husband and her family and submits completely to Kephalas. This was not a fringe practice. This was a common, accepted form of magic, a recognized way of dealing with the chaotic and dangerous emotions of love and desire. It reveals a mindset where another person's body and mind were seen as territory to be magically conquered and occupied. The flip side of these coercive love spells were equally brutal curses designed to punish infidelity or destroy a rival. A betrayed husband might commission a spell to make his wife's lover impotent, to bind his phallus so that it is as dead as the corpse of Osiris. A woman might curse her rival, asking the gods to make her barren, to make her wander the streets like a mad dog, or to inflict a disease that would destroy her beauty. These spells often involve sympathetic magic using bodily fluids. A man might use a drop of his semen in a spell to bind a woman to him forever. A woman might use a drop of her menstrual blood, a substance believed to hold immense and dangerous power, to curse a rival or to ensnare a man. This belief in the magical potency of bodily fluids created a culture of constant paranoia. A stray hair, a discarded piece of clothing, a drop of spittle. Any of these could be collected by an enemy and used as a magical link to attack you. The human body was not a private fortress. It was a collection of vulnerabilities, a series of open doorways through which magical forces could enter and wreak havoc. This entire system of magic operates on the same core principle we have seen in the grand rituals of the state, the idea that the universe can be controlled and manipulated through the right combination of ritual, words, and potent substances, particularly those associated with sex, birth, and death. The farmer cursing his neighbour's livestock, the jilted lover torturing a doll with needles, and the pharaoh inseminating the Nile are all points on the same continuum. They all spring from a worldview that is fundamentally alien to us, a world without a clear boundary between the physical and the metaphysical, a world where sex was not an act of love, but a terrifying and dangerous magical weapon, a key that could unlock the gates of creation or unleash the demons of the underworld. It was a power to be wielded, to be feared, and, if necessary, to be used to utterly dominate the will of another. This was the reality of love and desire in ancient Egypt, not a dance of seduction, but a magical war. Now we must turn our gaze from the spells of individuals to the divine pantheon itself, and confront a set of stories so sexually explicit, so filled with violence, incest, and bizarre transformations that they make the dramas of mortal life seem tame. These were not obscure, forgotten myths. These were the foundational tales taught to every child, the sacred narratives that explain the very nature of the gods and the cosmos. And they are saturated with a kind of brutal, chaotic sexuality that stands in stark contrast to the serene, orderly image of Egyptian religion. At the heart of this divine drama is the epic conflict between Horus, the rightful heir and god of order, and his uncle Set, the god of chaos, storms, and the untamed desert. This is not a simple story of good versus evil. It is a prolonged, vicious, and deeply personal war for control of the universe, and the battlefield is often their own bodies. One of the most famous and most graphic episodes in their struggle is recounted in a papyrus from the reign of Ramesses V, known as the Contendings of Horus and Set. After numerous physical battles and legal disputes before the tribunal of the gods, Set decides to change his tactics. He feigns reconciliation and invites his young nephew Horus to his house for a feast. "How beautiful is this day," Set declares, pretending to be filled with goodwill. But as night falls, his true intentions are revealed. The text states, "Now when it was evening, the bed was spread for them, and they both lay down. And in the night, Set caused his phallus to become stiff, and he inserted it between the thighs of Horus." Set's goal was not pleasure. This was an act of political and magical domination. In the ancient world, particularly in Egypt, the act of sexual penetration was an unambiguous assertion of dominance. The one who penetrates is the superior. The one who is penetrated is the inferior. By forcibly feminizing his nephew, by treating him as a woman, Set was attempting to disqualify him from the throne. He was trying to prove in the most visceral way possible that Horus was not a powerful masculine god fit to rule, but a weak, submissive subordinate. He intended to go before the other gods the next morning and declare, "I have performed the work of a man against him." But Horus is not a helpless victim. He is cunning. The text tells us that Horus, realizing what is happening, cupped his hands and caught the semen of Set. He has captured the weapon that was meant to destroy him. He runs to his mother, Isis, holding the evidence of his uncle's assault. "See what Set has done to me," he cries. Isis, the master of magic, does not panic. She erupts in rage. But her response is calculated and strategic. She takes a copper knife and, in an act of extreme maternal protection, cuts off her son's contaminated hands and throws them in the river. She then fashions him new hands. Next, she moves to the counterattack. She takes her son Horus, the text says, and she caused his phallus to become stiff. She inserted it into a pot, and she caused his semen to go down into it. She now possesses the pure, legitimate, creative essence of the rightful king. Isis then goes to Set's garden and secretly spreads Horus's semen over the lettuce plants, which she knows are Set's favourite food. Later that day, Set, unaware of the trap, eats the lettuces. He has unknowingly consumed the seed of his rival. He has, in a magical sense, been impregnated by Horus. The stage is now set for one of the most bizarre scenes in all of world mythology. Set goes before the divine tribunal, confident in his victory. He announces, "Let me be made ruler, for as to Horus, the one who is standing there, I have performed the work of a man against him." The gods, the Ennead, cry out in disgust. They spit on Horus's face and declare him unfit. But Horus laughs. He challenges Set's claim. "It is false what Set has said. Let the semen of Set be summoned, and let us see from where it answers." The great god Thoth, the divine scribe and magician, performs the incantation. He calls out to the semen of Set, and a faint voice answers, not from Horus but from the marshes where Isis had thrown Horus's hands. Then Horus makes his move. "Let my semen be summoned, and let us see from where it answers." Thoth calls out, and to the utter shock of all the gods, the semen of Horus answers from inside Set's own body. A shining, golden solar disk, the very essence of divine kingship, emerges from Set's forehead. Set is utterly humiliated, defeated not by force of arms, but by a magical sexual trap. He has been proven the subordinate, the receptacle. Horus's claim to the throne is vindicated. This story is a theological treatise. a legal argument about legitimacy and succession. But it is argued through acts of rape, masturbation, and magical impregnation. It reveals a divine world that is not serene and ordered, but chaotic, violent, and saturated with a sexuality that is used as a weapon of war and an instrument of political power. It tells the Egyptians that the universe they inhabit is a place of constant struggle, where even the gods themselves are subject to the messy, brutal, and often perverse mechanics of the body. This brutal, chaotic sexuality was not confined to the cosmic struggle for the throne. It permeated the entire divine family, creating a web of myths that are, to our eyes, a bewildering tangle of incest, creation, and destruction. The very structure of the Egyptian pantheon is built upon a foundation of divine incest. The first children of the creator god, Atum, were Shu, air, and Tefnut-Tuot, moisture. This brother and sister pair then produced their own children, Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. Geb and Nut, another brother-sister pairing, were locked in a perpetual passionate embrace, their bodies forming the very boundaries of the physical world. Their father, Shu, had to forcibly separate them, thrusting his daughter Nut into the heavens to form the arch of the sky, while holding his son Geb down to form the earth. The stars were believed to be the jewels on Nut's body, and every evening she would swallow the sun, god Ra, taking him into her body, only to give birth to him again each morning at sunrise. The entire cycle of day and night was conceived as a daily act of divine incest, consumption, and rebirth. This foundational couple, Geb and Nut, then gave birth to the two most important divine pairs in Egyptian history, Osiris and his sister wife Isis, and Set and his sister wife Nephthys. The central drama of Egyptian religion is, therefore, a family feud, a story of one brother murdering another, and a sister resurrecting her brother husband to conceive a son who will avenge him. The survival of the cosmos depended on these incestuous relationships. They were not seen as a transgression, but as a necessity, a way of keeping the divine bloodline pure and the cosmic order intact. This divine precedent had a direct impact on the royal family of Egypt. The pharaoh, as the living Horus, was not just encouraged, but often required to imitate the gods. Royal incest, particularly brother-sister marriage, was a common practice, especially in the later periods of Egyptian history. It was a way for the pharaoh to demonstrate his divinity, to prove that he was not bound by the same rules as mortals. Like the gods, his family was a closed loop of divine power. This practice reached its zenith during the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek family that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. They enthusiastically adopted the pharaonic custom, with brothers marrying sisters for generations, creating a royal family that was both divinely sanctioned and genetically fraught. But the myths went beyond simple incest. They explored a fluid and often violent spectrum of divine sexuality. The creator god Atum was both male and female, referred to in some texts as the Great He-She. The god Hapi, the spirit of the Nile flood, was depicted as a man with large, pendulous breasts, a symbol of his androgynous, life-giving power. Even Ra, the supreme sun god, was subject to the strange and dangerous currents of divine sexuality. One myth tells of how the goddess Isis, hungry for power, decided to learn Ra's secret name, the source of all his authority. To do this, she devised a cunning and gruesome trap. Ra had grown old and feeble, and as he walked, saliva would dribble from his mouth and fall to the earth. Isis collected this divine, spittle-soaked mud. She then moulded it into the form of a serpent, a magical golem, and placed it on the path where Ra walked every day. When Ra passed, the serpent, animated by the goddess's magic and born from the god's own essence, bit him. A terrible fiery poison coursed through Ra's veins. The sun god, the creator of all things, screamed in agony. The poison burned hotter than any fire. All the gods rushed to his side, but none could help him. His power was useless against a poison born of his own body. Isis then appeared, feigning concern. "What is it, divine father?" she asked. "A serpent has bitten me, He cried. "I am burning, I am freezing, my limbs are trembling." Isis offered her help, but on one condition. "Tell me your secret name," she said. For a person can only be healed if the magician knows their true name. Ra, in his pride, refused. He tried to list all his other names and titles. I am the maker of heaven and earth. I am the one who orders the mountains. I am Khepri in the morning, Ra at noon, and Atum in the evening. But Isis was not fooled. Your true name is not among those, she insisted, as the poison burned deeper. Finally, broken by the unbearable pain, Ra relented. He whispered his secret name to Isis, transferring his ultimate power to her. Isis, now in possession of his magic, easily healed him. This story is a power struggle, but it is fought with bodily fluids and magical serpents. It shows a universe where even the greatest of the gods is vulnerable, where power can be stolen through a cunning, intimate violation. It portrays a world where saliva can become a weapon, and where knowledge is inextricably linked to the physical essence of a being. These myths taken together paint a picture of a universe that is terrifyingly alive, a place of constant creation and destruction, where the gods themselves are driven by lust, jealousy, and a hunger for power, and where the most sacred act of creation and the most violent act of domination are often one and the same.